Chapter 15, Part 1 of The Guns of Shiloh. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Guns of Shiloh by Joseph A. Altsheler. Chapter 15, The Red Dawn of Shiloh, Part 1. Dick stood appalled when he heard the terrible shout in the dawn and the crash of cannon and rifles rolling down upon the Union lines. It was already a shout of triumph, and as he gazed he saw through the woods the red line of flame sweeping on without a halt. The surprise had been complete. Hardee, leading the Southern advance, struck Peabody's Northern brigade and smashed it up instantly. The men did not even have time to seize their rifles. They had no chance to form into ranks, and the officers themselves, as they shouted commands, were struck down. Men killed or wounded were falling everywhere. Almost before they had time to draw a free breath, the remnants of the brigade were driven upon those behind it. Hardee also rushed upon Sherman, but there he found a foe of tough metal. The man who had foreseen the enormous extent of the war, although taken by surprise too, did not lose his courage or presence of mind. His men had time to seize their arms, and he formed a hasty line of battle. He also had the forethought to send word to the general in his rear to close up the gap between him and the next general in the line. Then he shifted one of his own brigades until there was a ravine in front of it to protect his men, and he hurried a battery to his flank. Never was Napoleon's maxim that men are nothing, a man is everything, more justified. And never did the genius of Sherman shine more brilliantly than on that morning. It was he, alone, cool of mind and steady in the face of overwhelming peril, who first faced the Southern rush. He inspired his troops with his own courage, and though pale of face, they bent forward to meet the red whirlwind that was rushing down upon them. Like a blaze running through dry grass, the battle extended in almost an instant along the whole front, and the deep woods were filled with the roar of 80,000 men in conflict. And Grant, as at Donelson, was far away. The thunder and blaze of the battle increased swiftly and to a frightful extent. The Southern generals, eager, alert, and full of success, pushed in all their troops. The surprised Northern army was giving away at all points, except where Sherman stood. Hardee continued his rush, broke the Northern line asunder, and his brigades, wrapping themselves around Sherman, strove to destroy him. Although he saw his lines crumbling away before him, Sherman never flinched. The ravine in front of him and rough ground on one side defended him to a certain extent. The men fired their rifles as fast as they could load and reload, and the cannon on their flanks never ceased to pour shot and shell into the ranks of their opponents. The gunners were shot down, but new ones rose at once in their places. The fiercest conflict yet seen on American soil was raging here. North would not yield. South ever rushed anew to the attack, and a vast cloud of mingled flame and smoke enclosed them both. Dick had stood as if petrified, staring at the billows of flame, while the thunder of great armies in battle stunned his ears. He realized suddenly that he was alone. Colonel Kenton had said the night before that he did not know what to do with him, but that he would find a way in the morning. But he had been forgotten, and he knew it was natural that he should be. His fate was but a trifle in the mighty event that was passing. There was no time for anyone in the Southern army to bother about him. And then he understood, too, that he was free. The whole orphan brigade had passed on into the red heart of the battle and had left him there alone. Now his mind leaped out of its paralysis. All his senses became alert. In that vast whirlwind of fire and smoke, no one would notice that a single youth was stealing through the forest in an effort to rejoin his own people. Action followed swift upon thought. He curved about in the woods and then ran rapidly toward the point where the fire seemed thinnest. He did not check his pace until he had gone at least a mile, and then he paused to see if he could tell how the battle was going. Its roar seemed louder than ever in his ears, and in front of him was a vast red line which extended an unseen distance through the forest. Now and then the wild and thrilling rebel yell rose above the roar of cannon and the crash of rifles. Dick saw with a sinking of the heart, and yet he had known that it would be so, that the red line of flame had moved deeper into the heart of the Northern camp. It had passed the Northern outposts, and at many points it had swept over the Northern center. He feared that there was but a huddled and confused mass beyond it. He saw something lying at his feet. It was a Confederate military cloak which some officer had cast off as he rushed to the charge. He picked it up, threw it about his own shoulders, and then tossed away his cap. If he fell in with Confederate troops, they would not know him from one of their own, and it was no time now to hold cross-examinations. He took a wide curve, and after another mile came to a hillock, upon which he stood a little while panting. And again he was appalled at the sight he beheld. Bull Run and Donelson were small beside this. Here 80,000 men were locked fast in furious conflict. Raw and undisciplined many of these farmer lads of the West and South were, but in battle they showed a courage and tenacity not surpassed by the best trained troops that ever lived. The floating smoke reached Dick where he stood, stung his eyes, and a powerful odor of burned gunpowder assailed his nostrils. But neither sight nor odors held him back. Instead, they drew him on with overwhelming force. He must rejoin his own and do his best, however little it counted in the whole. It was now well on into the morning of a brilliant and hot Sunday. He did not know it, but the combat was raging fiercest then around the little church which should have been sacred. Drawing a deep breath of an air which was shot with fire and smoke, and which was hot to his lungs, Dick began to run again. Almost before he noticed it, he was running by the side of a Southern regiment which had been ordered to veer about and attack some new point in the Northern line. Keeping his presence of mind, he shouted with them as they rushed on, and presently dropped away from them in the smoke. He was conscious now of a new danger. Twigs and bits of bark began to rain down upon him, and he heard the unpleasant whistle of bullets over his head. They were the bullets of his own people, seeking to repel the Southern charge. A minute later, a huge shell burst near him, covering him with flying earth. At first he thought he had been hit by fragments of the shell, but when he shook himself, he found that he was all right. He took yet a wider curve, and before he was aware of the treacherous ground, plunged into a swamp bordering one of the creeks. He stood for a few moments in mud and water to his waist, but he knew that he had passed from the range of the Union fire. Twigs and bark no longer fell around him, and that most unpleasant whiz of bullets was gone. He pulled himself out of the mire and ran along the edge of the creek toward the roar of the battle. He knew now that he had passed around the flank of the Southern army and could approach the flank of his own. He ran fast and then began to hear bullets again, but now they were coming from the Southern army. He threw away the cloak, and presently he emerged into a mass of men who, under the continual urging of their officers, were making a desperate defense, firing, drawing back, reloading, and firing again. In front the woods swarmed with the Southern troops, who drove incessantly upon them. Dick snatched up a rifle, plenty were lying upon the ground where the owners had fallen with them, and fired into the attacking ranks. Then he reloaded swiftly and pressed on toward the Union center. "What troops are these?" he asked of an officer who was knotting a handkerchief about a bleeding wrist. "From Illinois. Who are you?" "I'm Lieutenant Richard Mason of Colonel Arthur Winchester's Kentucky regiment. I was taken prisoner by the enemy last night, but I escaped this morning. Do you know where my regiment is?" "Keep straight on, and you'll strike it, or what's left of it, if anything at all is left. It's a black day." Dick scarcely caught his last words as he dashed on through bullets, shell, and solid shot, over slain men and horses, over dismantled guns and gun carriages, and into the very heart of the flame and smoke. The thunder of battle was at its height now, because he was in the center of it. The roar of the great guns was continuous, but the unbroken crash of rifles by the scores of thousands was fiercer and more deadly. The officer had pointed toward the Kentucky regiment with his sword, and following the line, Dick ran directly into it. The very first face he saw was that of Colonel Winchester. "Dick, my lad," shouted the colonel, "where have you come from?" "From the Southern army. I was taken prisoner last night, almost within sight of our own. But when they charged this morning, they forgot me, and here I am." Colonel Winchester suddenly seized him by the shoulders and pushed him down. The regiment was behind a small ridge which afforded some protection, and all were lying down except the senior officers. "Welcome, Dick, to our hot little camp. The chances are about 100% out of 100% that this is the hottest place on earth today." The long, thin figure of Warner lay pressed against the ground. A handkerchief stained red was bound about his head, and his face was pale, but indomitable courage gleamed from his eyes. Just beyond him was Pennington, unhurt. "Thank God you haven't fallen, and that I've found you," exclaimed Dick. "I don't know whether you're so lucky after all," said Warner. "The Johnnies have been mowing us down. They dropped on us so suddenly this morning that they must have been sleeping in the same bed with us last night, and we didn't know it. I hear that we're routed nearly everywhere except here and where Sherman stands. Look out! Here they come again!" They saw tan faces and fierce eyes through the smoke, and the bullets swept down on them in showers. Lucky for them that the little ridge was there, and that they had made up their minds to stand to the last. They replied with their own deadly fire, yet many fell despite the shelter, and to both left and right the battle swelled afresh. Dick felt again that rain of bark and twigs and leaves. Sometimes a tree, cut through at its base by cannon balls, fell with a crash. Along the whole curving line the Southern generals ever urged forward their valiant troops. And now the courage and skill of Sherman shone supreme. Dick saw him often striding up and down the lines, ordering and begging his men to stand fast, although they were looking almost into the eyes of their enemies. The conflict became hand to hand, and assailant and assailed reeled to and fro. But Sherman would not give up. The fiercest attacks broke in vain on his iron front. McClernand, with whom he had quarreled the day before as to who should command the army while Grant was away, came up with reinforcements, and seeing what the fearless and resolute general had done, yielded him the place. The last of the charges broke for the time upon Sherman, and his exhausted regiment uttered a shout of triumph. But on both sides of him the Southern troops drove their enemy back and yet further back. Breckinridge, along with Lick Creek, was pushing everything before him. The Bishop general was doing well. Many of the Northern troops had not yet recovered from their surprise. A general and 3 whole regiments, struck on every side, were captured. It seemed that nothing could deprive the Southern army of victory, absolute and complete. General Johnston had marshaled his troops with superb skill, and intending to reap the full advantage of the surprise, he continually pushed them forward upon the shattered Northern lines. He led in person and on horseback the attack upon the Federal center. Around and behind him rode his staff, and the wild rebel yell swept again through the forest, when the soldiers saw the stern and lofty features of the chief whom they trusted leading them on. But fate, in the very moment of triumph that seemed overwhelming and sure, was preparing a terrible blow for the South. A bullet struck Johnston in the ankle. His boot filled with blood, and the wound continued to bleed fast. But despite the urging of his surgeon, who rode with him, he refused to dismount and have the wound bound up. How could he dismount at such a time, when the battle was at its height and the Union army was being driven into the creeks and swamps? He was wounded again by a piece of shell, and he sank dying from his horse. His officers crowded around him, seeking to hide their irreparable loss from the soldiers, the most costly death, with the exception of Stonewall Jackson's, sustained by the Confederacy in the whole war. But the troops, borne on by the impetus that success and the spirit of Johnston had given them, drove harder than ever against the Northern line. They crashed through it in many places, seizing prisoners and cannon. Almost the whole Northern camp was now in their possession, and many of the Southern lads, hungry from scanty rations, had stopped to seize the plenty that they found there. But enough persisted to give the Northern army no rest and press it back nearer and nearer to the marshes. End of chapter 15, part 1. Chapter 15, part 2 of The Guns of Shiloh. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Guns of Shiloh by Joseph A. Altsheler. Chapter 15. The Red Dawn of Shiloh, Part 2. The combat redoubled around Sherman. Johnston was gone, but his generals still shared his resolution. They turned an immense fire upon the point where stood Sherman and McClernand, now united by imminent peril. Their ranks were searched by shot and shell, and the bullets whizzed among them like a continuous swarm of hornets. Dick was still unwounded, but so much smoke and vapor had drifted about his face that he was compelled at times to rub his eyes that he might see. He felt a certain dizziness, too, and he did not know whether the incessant roaring in his ears came wholly from the cannon and rifle fire or partly from the pounding of his blood. "I feel that we are shaking," he shouted in the ears of Warner, who lay next to him. "I'm afraid we're going to give ground." "I feel it, too," Warner shouted back. "We've been here for hours, but we're shot to pieces. Half of our men must be killed or wounded. But how old Sherman fights!" The Southern leaders brought up fresh troops and hurled them upon Sherman. Again the combat was hand to hand, and to the right and left the supports of the indomitable Northern general were being cut away. Those brigades who had proved their mettle at Donelson and who had long stood fast were attacked so violently that they gave way, and the victors hurled themselves upon Sherman's flank. Dick and his two young comrades perceived through the flame and smoke the new attack. It seemed to Dick that they were being enclosed now by the whole Southern army, and he felt a sense of suffocation. He was dizzy from such a long and terrible strain and so much danger, and he was not really more than half conscious. He was loading and firing his rifle mechanically, but he always aimed at something in the red storm before him, although he never knew whether he hit or missed, and was glad of it. The division of Sherman had been standing there 7 hours, sustaining with undaunted courage the resolute attacks of the Southern army. But the sixth sense, warning Dick that it had begun to shake at last, was true. The sun had now passed the zenith and was pouring intense and fiery rays upon the field, sometimes piercing the clouds of smoke and revealing the faces of the men, black with sweat and burned gunpowder. A cry arose for Grant. Why did not their chief show himself upon the field? Was so great a battle to be fought with him away? And where was Buell? He had a second great army. He was to join them that day. What good would it be for him to come tomorrow? Many of them laughed in bitter derision. And there was Lew Wallace, too. They had heard that he was near the field with a strong division. Then why did he not come upon it and face the enemy? Again they laughed, that fierce and bitter laugh deep down in their throats. The attack upon Sherman never ceased for an instant. Now he was assailed not only from the front but from both flanks, and some even gaining the rear struck blows upon his division there. One brigade upon his left was compelled to give way, scattered, and lost its guns. The right wing was also driven in, and the center yielded slowly, although retaining its cohesion. The three lads were on their feet now, and it seemed to them that everything was lost. They could see the battle in front of them only, but rumors came to them that the army was routed elsewhere. But neither Sherman nor McClernand would yield, save for the slow retreat, yielding ground foot by foot only. And there were many unknown heroes around them. Sergeant Whitley blazed with courage and spirit. "We could be worse off than we are," he shouted to Dick. "General Buell's army may yet come." "Maybe we could be worse off than we are, but I don't see how it's possible," shouted Dick in return, a certain grim humor possessing him for the moment. "Look, what I said has come true already," shouted the sergeant. "Here is shelter that will help us to make a new stand." In their slow retreat they reached two low hills between which a small ravine ran. It was not a strong position, but Sherman used it to the utmost. His men fired from the protecting crests of the hills, and he filled the ravine with riflemen, who poured a deadly fire upon the assailants. Now Sherman ordered them to stand fast to the last man, because it was by this road that the division of Lew Wallace must come, if it come at all. But the Southern brigades followed them, and the battle raged anew, as fierce and deadly as ever. Although their army was routed at many points, the Northern officers showed indomitable courage. Driven back in the forest, they always strove to form the lines anew, and now their efforts began to show some success. Their resistance on the right hardened, and on the left they held fast to the chain of hills that covered the wharves and their stores at the river landing. As they took position here, 2 gunboats in the river began to send huge shells over their heads at the attacking Southern columns, maintaining a rapid and heavy fire which shook assailants and strengthened defenders. Again the water had come to the help of the North, and at the most critical moment. The whole Northern line was now showing a firmer front, and Grant himself was directing the battle. Fortune, which had played a game with Grant at Donelson, played a far greater one with him on the far greater field of Shiloh. The Red Dawn of Shiloh, when Johnston was sweeping his army before him, had found him at Savannah, far from the field of battle. The hardy and vigorous Nelson had arrived there in the night with Buell's vanguard, and Grant had ordered to march at speed the next day to join his own army. But he himself did not reach the field of Shiloh until 10 o'clock, when the fiercest battle yet known on the American continent had been raging for several hours. Grant and his staff, as they rode away from his headquarters, heard the booming of cannon in the direction of Shiloh. Some of them thought it was a mere skirmish, but it came continuously, like rolling thunder, and their trained ears told them that it rose from a line miles in length. One seeks to penetrate the mind of a commanding general at such a time, and see what his feelings were. Again the battle had been joined, and was at its height, and he away. Those trained ears told him also that the rolling thunder of the cannon was steadily moving toward them. It could mean only that the Northern army had been driven from its camp, and that the Southern army was pushing its victory to the utmost. In those moments his agony must have been intense. His great army not only attacked, but beaten, and he not there. He and his staff urged their horses forward, seeking to gain from them new ounces of speed. But the country was difficult, the hills were rough, and there were swamps and mire. And as they listened, the roar of the battle steadily came nearer and nearer. There was no break in the Northern retreat. The sweat, not of heat, but of mental agony, stood upon their faces. Grant was not the only one who suffered. Now they met some of the stragglers who flee from every battlefield, no matter what the nation. Their faces were white with fear, and they cried out that the Northern army was destroyed. Officers cursed them and struck at them with the flats of their swords, but they dodged the blows and escaped into the bushes. There was no time to pursue them. Grant and his staff never ceased to ride toward the storm of battle which raged far and wide around the little church of Shiloh. The stream of fugitives increased, and now they saw swarms of men who stood here and there, not running, but huddled and irresolute. Never did Fortune, who brought this, her favorite, from the depths, bring him again in her play so near to the verge of destruction. When he came upon the field, the battle seemed wholly lost, and the whole world would have cried that he was to blame. But the bulldog in Grant was never of stauncher breed than on that day. His face turned white, and he grew sick at the sight of the awful slaughter. A bullet broke the small sword at his side, but he did not flinch. Preserving the stern calm that always marked him on the field, he began to form his lines anew and strengthen the weaker points. Yet the condition of his army would have appalled a weaker will. It had been driven back 3 miles. His whole camp had been taken. His second line also had been driven in. Many thousands of men had fallen, and other thousands had been taken. 30 of his cannon were in the hands of the enemy, and although noon had now come and gone, there was no sound to betoken the coming of the troops led by Wallace or Nelson. Well might Grant's own stout heart have shrunk appalled from the task before him. Wallace was held back by confused orders, pardonable at such a time. The eager Nelson was detained at Savannah by Buell, who thought that the sounds of the engagement they heard in the Shiloh woods was a minor affair, and who wanted Nelson to wait for boats to take him there. It seemed sometimes to Dick, long afterward, when the whole of the great Shiloh battle became clear, that Fortune was merely playing a game of chess, with the earth as a board and the armies as pawns. Grant's army was ambushed, with its general absent. The other armies, which were almost at hand, were delayed for one reason or another, while as for the South, the genius that had planned the attack and that had carried it forward was quenched in death when victory was at its height. But for the present the lad had little time for such thoughts as these. The success of Sherman in holding the new position infused new courage into him and those around him. The men in gray, wearied with their immense exertions and having suffered frightful losses themselves, abated somewhat the energy and fierceness of their attack. The dissolved Northern regiments had time to reform. Grant seized a new position along a line of hills in front of which ran a deep ravine filled with brushwood. He and his officers appreciated the advantage, and they massed their troops there as fast as they could. Now fortune, after having brought Grant to the verge of the pit, was disposed to throw chance in his way. The hills and the ravine were one. Another, and most important it was the presence of guns of the heaviest caliber landed some days ago from the fleet and left there until their disposition could be determined. A quick-witted colonel, Webster by name, gathered up all the gunners who had lost their own guns and who had been driven back in the retreat, and manned this great battery of siege guns, just as the Southern generals were preparing to break down the last stand of the North. Meanwhile, a terrible rumor had been spreading in the ranks of the Southern troops. The word was passed from soldier to soldier that their commander, Johnston, whom they had believed invincible, had been killed, and they did not trust so much Beauregard, who was left in command, nor those who helped. Their fiery spirit abated somewhat. There was no decrease of courage, but continuous victory did not seem so easy now. Confusion invaded the triumphant army also. Beauregard had divided the leadership on the field among 3 of his lieutenants. Hardee now urged on the center, Bragg commanded the right, and Polk, the bishop general, led the left. It was Bragg's division that was about to charge the great battery of siege guns that the alert Webster had manned so quickly. 5 minutes more and Webster would have been too late. Here again were the fortunes of Grant brought to the very verge of the pit. The Northern gunboats at the mouth of the Lick Creek moved forward a little, and their guns were ready to support the battery. The Kentucky regiment was wedged in between the battery and a brigade, and it was gasping for breath. Colonel Winchester, slightly wounded in 3 places, commanded his men to lie down, and they gladly threw themselves upon the earth. There was a momentary lull in the battle. Wandering winds caught up the banks of smoke and carried most of them away. Dick, as he rose a little, saw the Southern troops massing in the forest for an attack upon their new position. They seemed to be only a few yards away, and he clearly observed the officers walking along the front of the lines. It flashed upon him that they must hold these hills or Grant's army would perish. Where was Buell? Why did he not come? If the Southerners destroyed one Northern army today, they would destroy another tomorrow. They would break the 2 halves of the Union force in the West into pieces, first one and then the other. "What do you see, Dick?" asked Warner, who was lying almost flat upon his face. "The Confederate army is getting ready to wipe us off the face of the earth. Up with your rifle, George. They'll be upon us in 2 minutes." They heard a sudden shout behind them. It was a glad shout, and well it might be. Nelson, held back by Buell's orders, had listened long to the booming of the cannon off in the direction of Shiloh. Nothing could convince him that a great battle was not going on, and all through the morning he chafed and raged, and as the sound of the cannon grew louder he believed that Grant's army was losing. Nelson obtained Buell's leave at last to march for Shiloh, but it was a long road across hills and creeks and through swamps. The cannon sank deep in the mire, and then the ardent Nelson left them behind. Now he knew there was a great need for haste. The flashing and thundering in front of them showed to the youngest soldier in his command that a great battle was in progress, and that it was going against the North. His division at last reached Pittsburgh Landing and was carried across the river in the steamers. One brigade, led by Ammen, outstripped the rest and rushed in behind the great battery and to its support just as the Southern bugles once more sounded the charge. Dick shouted with joy, too, when he saw the new troops. The next moment the enemy was upon them, charging directly through a frightful discharge from the great guns. The riddled regiments which had fought so long gave way before the bayonets, but the fresh troops took their places and poured a terrible fire into the assaulting columns, and the great guns of the battery hurled a new storm of shell and solid shot. The ranks of the Southern troops, worn by a full day of desperate fighting, were broken. They had crossed the ravine into the very mouths of the Northern guns, but now they were driven back into the ravine and across it. Cannon and rifles rained missiles upon them there, and they withdrew into the woods, while for the first time in all that long day a shout of triumph rose from the Union lines. Another lull came in the battle. "What are they doing now, Dick?" asked the Vermonter. "I can't see very well, but they seem to be gathering in the forest for a fresh attack. Do you know, George, that the sun is almost down? It's certainly time. It's been at least a month since the Johnnies ran out of the forest in the dawn and jumped on us." It was true that the day was almost over, although but few had noticed the fact. The east was already darkening, and a rosy glow from the west fell across the torn forest. Here and there a dead tree, set on fire by the shells, burned slowly, little flames creeping along trunk and boughs. Bragg was preparing to hurl his entire force upon Sherman and the battery. At that moment Beauregard, now his chief, arrived. But a few minutes of daylight were left, and the swarthy Louisianian looked at the great losses in his own ranks. He believed that the army of Buell was so far away that it could not arrive that night, and he withheld the charge. The Southern army withdrew a little into the woods. The night rushed down, and Shiloh's terrible first day was over. End of chapter 15, part 2.
Chapter 16, Part 1 of The Guns of Shiloh. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Guns of Shiloh by Joseph A. Altsheler. Chapter 16, The Fierce Finish of Shiloh, Part 1. Dick, who had been lying under cover just behind the crest of one of the low ridges, suddenly heard the loud beating of his heart. He did not know for a moment or two that the sound came so distinctly because the mighty tumult which had been raging around him all day had ceased, as if by a concerted signal. Those blinding flashes of flame no longer came from the forest before him. The shot and shell quit their horrible screaming, and the air was free from the unpleasant hiss of countless bullets. He stretched himself a little and stood up. The lads all around him were standing up and were beginning to talk to each other in the high-pitched, shouting voices that they had been compelled to use all day long, not yet realizing to the full that the tumult of the battle had ceased. The boy felt stiff and sore in every bone and muscle, and, although the cannon and rifles were silent, there was still a hollow roaring in his ears. His eyes were yet dim from the smoke, and his head felt heavy and dull. He gazed vacantly at the forest in front of him, and wondered dimly why the Southern army was not still there, attacking as it had attacked for so many hours. But the deep woods were silent and empty. Coils and streamers of smoke floated about among the trees, and suddenly a gray squirrel hopped out on a bough and began to chatter wildly. Dick, despite himself, laughed, but the laugh was hysterical. He could appreciate the feelings of the squirrel, which probably had been imprisoned in a hollow of the tree all day long, listening to this tremendous battle, and squirrels were not used to such battles. It was a trifle that made him laugh, but everything was out of proportion now. Life did not go on in the usual way at all. The ordinary occupations were gone, and people spent most of their time trying to kill one another. He rubbed his hands across his eyes and cleared them of the smoke. The battle was certainly over for the day at least, and neither he nor his comrades had sufficient vitality yet to think of the morrow. The twilight was fast deepening into night. The last rosy glow of the sun faded, and thick darkness enveloped the vast forest, in which 20,000 men had fallen, and in which most of them yet lay, the wounded with the dead. There was presently a deep boom from the river, and a shell fired by one of the gunboats curved far over their heads and dropped into the forest, where the Southern army was encamped. All through the night and at short but regular intervals the gunboats maintained this warning fire, heartening the Union soldiers and telling them at every discharge that however they might have to fight for the land, the water was always theirs. Dick saw Colonel Winchester going among his men, and pulling himself together, he saluted his chief. "Any orders, sir?" he said. "No, Dick, my boy, none for the present," replied the colonel a little sadly. "Half of my poor regiment is killed or wounded, and the rest are so exhausted that they are barely able to move. But they fought magnificently, Dick. They had to, or be crushed. It is only here that we have withstood the rush of the Southern army, and it is probable that we too would have gone had not night come to our help." "Then we have been beaten?" "Yes, Dick, we have been beaten, and beaten badly. It was the surprise that did it. How on earth we could have let the Southern army creep upon us and strike unaware I don't understand. But Dick, my boy, there will be another battle tomorrow, and it may tell a different tale. Some prisoners whom we have taken say that Johnston has been killed, and Beauregard is no such leader as he." "Will the army of General Buell reach us tonight?" "Buell himself is here. He has been with Grant for some time, and all his brigades are marching at the double quick. Lew Wallace arrived less than half an hour ago with 7,000 men, fresh and eager for battle. Dick, my boy, we'll have 40,000 new troops on the field at the next dawn, and before God we'll wipe out the disgrace of today. Listen to the big guns from the boats as they speak at intervals. Why, I can understand the very words they speak. They are saying to the Southern army, 'Look out, look out. We're coming in the morning, and it's we who'll attack now.'" Dick saw that Colonel Winchester himself was excited. The pupils of his eyes were dilated, and a red spot glowed in either cheek. Like all the other officers, he was stung by the surprise and defeat, and he could barely wait for the morning and revenge. Colonel Winchester walked away to a council that had been called, and Dick turned to Pennington and Warner, who were not hurt, save for slight wounds. Warner had recovered his poise, and was soon as calm and dry as ever. "Dick," he said, "we're some distance from where we started this morning. There's nothing like being shoved along when you don't want to go. The next time they'll tell me there's nothing in a thicket, I expect to search it and find a rebel army at least 100,000 strong right in the middle of it." "How large do you suppose the Southern army was?" asked Pennington. "I had a number of looks at it," replied Warner, "and I should say from the way it acted that it numbered at least 3,000,000 men. I know that at times not less than 10,000 were aiming their rifles at my own poor and unworthy person. What a waste of energy for so many men to shoot at me all at once. I wish the Johnnies would go away and let us alone." The last words were high-pitched and excited. His habitual self-control broke down for a moment, and the tremendous excitement and nervous tension of the day found vent in his voice. But in a few seconds he recovered himself and looked rather ashamed. "Boys," he said, "I apologize." "You needn't," said Pennington. "There have been times today when I felt brave as a lion, and lots of other times I was scared most to death. It would have helped me a lot then if I could have opened my mouth and yelled at the top of my voice." Sergeant Daniel Whitley was leaning against a stump, and while he was calmly lighting a pipe, he regarded the three boys with a benevolent gaze. "None of you need be ashamed of being scared," he said. "I've been in a lot of fights myself, though all of them were mere skirmishes when put alongside of this, and I've been scared a heap today. I've been scared for myself, and I've been scared for the regiment, and I've been scared for the whole army, and I've been scared on general principles, but here we are, alive and kicking, and we ought to feel powerful thankful for that." "We are," said Dick. Then he rubbed his head as if some sudden thought had occurred to him. "What is it, Dick?" asked Warner. "I've realized all at once that I'm tremendously hungry. The Confederates broke up our breakfast. We never had time to think of dinner, and now it's nothing to eat." "Me too," said Pennington. "If you were to hit me in the stomach, I'd give back a hollow sound like a drum. Why don't somebody ring the supper bell?" But fires were soon lighted along their whole front, and provisions were brought up from the rear and from the steamers. The soldiers, feeling their strength returning, ate ravenously. They also talked much of the battle. Many of them were yet under the influence of hysterical excitement. They told extraordinary stories of the things they had seen and done, and they believed all they told were true. They ate fiercely, at first almost like wolves, but after a while they resolved into their true state as amiable young human beings and were ashamed of themselves. All the while Buell's Army of the Ohio was passing over the river and joining Grant's Army of the Tennessee. Regiment after regiment and brigade after brigade crossed. The guns that Nelson had been forced to leave behind were also brought up and were taken over with the other batteries. While the shattered remnants of the Army of the Tennessee were resting, the fresh Army of the Ohio was marching by it in the late hours of the night in order to face the Southern foe in the morning. The Southern army itself lay deep in the woods from which it had driven its enemy. Always the assailant through the day, its losses had been immense. Many thousands had fallen, and no new troops were coming to take their place. Continual reinforcements came to the north throughout the night. Not a soldier came to the south. Beauregard, at dawn, would have to face twice his numbers, at least half of whom were fresh troops. Another conference was held by the Southern generals in the forest, but now the central figure, the great Johnston, was gone. The others, however, summoned their courage anew, and passed the whole night arranging their forces, cheering the men, and preparing for the morn. Their scouts and skirmishers kept watch on the Northern camp, and the Southerners believed that while they had whipped only one army the day before, they could whip two on the morrow. Dick and his friends meanwhile were lying on the earth, resting, but not able to sleep. The nerves, drawn so tightly by the day's work, were not yet relaxed wholly. A deep apathy seized them all. Dick, from a high point on which he lay, saw the dark surface of the Tennessee, and the lights on the puffing steamers as they crossed, bearing the Army of the Ohio. His mind did not work actively now, but he felt that they were saved. The deep river, although it was on their flank, seemed to flow as a barrier against the foe, and it was, in fact, a barrier more and more, as without its command the Second Union Army could never have come to the relief of the First. Dick, after a while, saw Colonel Winchester and other officers near him. They were talking of their losses. They gave the names of many generals and colonels who had been killed. Presently they moved away, and he fell into an uneasy sleep, or rather doze, from which he was awakened after a while by a heavy rumbling sound of a distant cannonade. The boy sprang up, wondering why anyone should wish to renew the battle in the middle of the night, and then he saw that it was no battle. The sound was thunder rolling heavily on the southern horizon, and the night had become very dark. Vivid flashes of lightning cut the sky, and a strong wind rushed among the trees. Heavy drops of water struck him in the face, and then the rain swept down. Dick did not seek protection from the storm, nor did any of those near him. The cool drops were grateful to their faces after the heat and strife of the day. Their pulses became stronger, and the blood flowed in a quickened torrent through their veins. They let it pour upon them, merely seeking to keep their ammunition dry. 10,000 wounded were yet lying untouched in the forest, but the rain was grateful to them too. When they could, they turned their fevered faces up to it that it might beat upon them and bring grateful coolness. Deep in the night, a council like that of the Southern generals was held in the Northern camp, also. Grant, his face an expressionless mask, presided, and said but little. Buell, Sherman, McClernand, Nelson, Wallace, and others were there, and Buell and Sherman, like their chief, spoke little. The three men upon whom most rested were very taciturn that night, but it is likely that extraordinary thoughts were passing in the minds of every one of the three. Grant, after a day in which any one of a dozen chances would have wrecked him, must have concluded that in very deed and truth he was the favorite child of fortune. When one is saved again and again from the very verge, he begins to believe that failure is impossible, and in that very belief lies the greatest guard against failure. It is said of Grant that in the night after his great defeat around the church of Shiloh he was still confident, that he told his generals they would certainly win on the morrow, and he reminded them that if the Union army had suffered terribly, the Southern army must have suffered almost equally so, and would face them at dawn with numbers far less than their own. He had not displayed the greatest skill, but he had shown the greatest moral courage, and now on the night between battles it was that quality that was needed most. Dick, not having slept any the night before, and having passed through a day of fierce battle, was overcome after midnight, and sank into a sleep that was mere lethargy. He awoke once before dawn and remembered, but vaguely, all that had happened. Yet he was conscious that there was much movement in the forest. He heard the tread of many feet, the sound of commands, the neigh of horses, and the rumbling of cannon wheels. The Army of the Ohio was passing to the exposed flank of the Army of the Tennessee, and at dawn it would all be in line. He also caught flitting glimpses of the Tennessee, and of the steamers loaded with troops still crossing, and he heard the boom of the heavy cannon on the gunboats which still, at regular and short intervals, sent huge shells curving into the forest toward the camp of the Southern army. He also saw near him Warner and Pennington sound asleep on the ground, and then he sank back into his own lethargic slumber. He was awakened by the call of a trumpet, and as he rose he saw the whole regiment, or rather what was left of it, rising with him. It was not yet dawn, and a light rain was falling, but smoldering fires disclosed the ground for some distance, and also the river on which the gunboats and transports were now gathered in a fleet. Colonel Winchester beckoned to him. "All right this morning, Dick?" he said. "Yes, sir. I'm ready for my duty." "And you, too, Warner and Pennington?" "We are, sir," they replied together. "Then keep close beside me. I don't know when I may want you for a message. Daybreak will be here in a half hour. The entire Army of the Ohio, led by General Buell in person, will be in position then or very shortly afterward, and a new, and we hope a very different, battle will begin." Food and coffee were served to the men, and while the rain was still falling they formed in line and awaited the dawn. The desire to retrieve their fortunes was as strong among the farmer lads as it was among the officers, who took care to spread among them the statement that Buell's army alone was as numerous as the Southern force, and probably more numerous since their enemy must have sustained terrible losses. Thus they stood patiently, while the rain thinned and the sun at last showed a red edge through floating clouds. End of chapter 16, part 1. Chapter 16, Part 2 of The Guns of Shiloh. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Guns of Shiloh by Joseph A. Altsheler. Chapter 16, The Fierce Finish of Shiloh, Part 2. They waited yet a little while longer, and then the boom of a heavy gun in the forest told them that the enemy was advancing to begin the battle afresh. Again it was the Southern army that attacked, although it was no surprise now. Yet Beauregard and his generals were still sanguine of completing the victory. Their scouts and skirmishers had failed to discover that the entire army of Buell also was now in front of them. Bragg was gathering his division on the left to hurl it like a thunderbolt upon Grant's shattered brigades. Hardee and the Bishop General were in the center, and Breckinridge led the right. But as they moved forward to attack, the Union troops came out to meet them. Nelson had occupied the high ground between Lick and Owl Creeks, and his and the Southern troops met in a fierce clash shortly after dawn. Beauregard, drawn by the firing at that point, and noticing the courage and tenacity with which the Northern troops held their ground, sending in volley after volley, divined at once that these were not the beaten troops of the day before, but new men. This swarthy general, volatile and dramatic, nevertheless had great penetration. He understood on the instant a fact that his soldiers did not comprehend until later. He knew that the whole army of Buell was now before him. For the moment it was Beauregard and Buell who were the protagonists, instead of Grant and Johnston as on the day before. The Southern leader gathered all his forces and hurled them upon Nelson. Weary though the Southern soldiers were, their attack was made with utmost fire and vigor. A long and furious combat ensued. The Southern division under Cheatham rushed to the help of their fellows. Buell's forces were driven in again and again, and only his heavy batteries enabled him to regain his lost ground. Buell led splendid troops that he had trained long and rigidly, and they had not been in the conflict the day before. Fresh and with unbroken ranks, not a man wounded or missing, they had entered the battle, and both Grant and Buell, as well as their division commanders, expected an easy victory where the Army of the Ohio stood. Buell, to his amazement, saw himself reduced to the defensive. He and Grant had reckoned that the decimated brigades of the South could not stand at all before him, but just as on the first day they came on with the fierce rebel yell, hurling themselves upon superior numbers, taking the cannon of their enemy, losing them and retaking them and losing them again, but never yielding. The great conflict increased in violence. Buell, a man of iron courage, saw that his soldiers must fight to the uttermost, not for victory only, but even to ward off defeat. The dawn was now far advanced. The rain had ceased, and the sun again shot down sheaves of fiery rays upon a vast low cloud of fire and smoke in which thousands of men met in desperate combat. 9 o'clock came. It had been expected by Grant that Buell long before that time would have swept everything before him. But for 3 hours Buell had been fighting to keep himself from being swept away. The Southern troops seemed animated by that extraordinary battle fever and absolute contempt of death which distinguished them so often during this war. Buell's army was driven in on both flanks, and only the center held fast. It began to seem possible that the South, despite her reduced ranks, might yet defeat both Northern armies. Another battery dashed up to the relief of the men in blue. It was charged at once by the men in gray so fiercely that the gunners were glad to escape with their guns, and once more the wild rebel yell of triumph swelled through the Southern forest. Dick, standing with his comrades on one of the ridges that they had defended so well, listened to the roar of conflict on the wing, ever increasing in volume, and watched the vast clouds of smoke gathering over the forest. He could see from where he stood the flash of rifle fire and the blaze of cannon, and both eye and ear told him that the battle was not moving back upon the South. "It seems that we do not make headway, sir," he said to Colonel Winchester, who also stood by him, looking and listening. "Not that I can perceive," replied the colonel, "and yet with the rush of 40,000 fresh troops of ours upon the field I deemed victory quick and easy. How the battle grows! How the South fights!" Colonel Winchester walked away presently and joined Sherman, who was eagerly watching the mighty conflict, into which he knew that his own worn and shattered troops must sooner or later be drawn. He walked up and down in front of his lines, saying little but seeing everything. His tall form was seen by all his men. He too must have felt a singular thrill at that moment. He must have known that his star was rising. He, more than any other, with his valor, penetrating mind and decision, had saved the Northern army from complete destruction the first day at Shiloh. He had not been able to avert defeat, but he had prevented utter ruin. His division alone had held together in the face of the Southern attack until night came. Sherman must have recalled, too, how his statement that the North would need 200,000 troops in the West alone had been sneered at, and he had been called mad. But he neither boasted nor predicted, continuing to watch intently the swelling battle.
"I had enough fighting yesterday to last me 100 years," said Warner to Dick, "but it seems that I'm to have more today. If the Johnnies had any regard for the rules of war, they'd have retreated long ago." "We'll win yet," said Dick hopefully, "but I don't think we can achieve any big victory. Look, there's General Grant himself." Grant was passing along his whole line. While leaving the main battle to Buell, he retained general command and watched everything. He, too, observed the failure of Buell's army to drive the enemy before them, and he must have felt a sinking of the heart, but he did not show it. Instead, he spoke only of victory, when he made any comment at all, and sent the members of his staff to make new arrangements. He must bring into action every gun and man he had, or he would yet lose. It was now 10 o'clock, and the new battle had lasted with the utmost fury and desperation for 4 hours. Dick, after General Grant rode on, felt as if a sudden thrill had run through the whole army. He saw men rising from the earth and tightening their belts. He saw gunners gathering around their guns and making ready with the ammunition. He knew the remains of Grant's army were about to march upon the enemy, helping the Army of the Ohio to achieve the task that had proved so great. Sherman, McClernand, and other generals now passed among their troops, cheering them, telling them that the time had come to win back what they had lost the day before, and that victory was sure. They called upon them for another great effort, and a shout rolled along the line of willing soldiers. Sherman's whole division now raised itself up and rushed at the enemy, Dick and his comrades in the front of their own regiment. The whole Northern line was now engaged. Grant, true to his resolution, had hurled every man and every gun upon his foe. The Southern generals felt the immense weight of the numbers that were now driving down upon them. Their decimated ranks could not withstand the charge of two armies. In the center, where Buell's men, having stood fast from the first, were now advancing, they were compelled to give way and lost several guns. On the wings, the heavy Northern brigades were advancing also, and the whole Southern line was pushed back. So much inferior was the South in numbers that her enemy began to overlap her on the flanks also. A tremendous shout of exultation swept through the Northern ranks as they felt themselves advancing. The promises of their generals were coming true, and there is nothing sweeter than victory after defeat. Fortune, after frowning upon her so long, was now smiling upon the North. The exultant cheer swept through the ranks again, and back came the defiant rebel yell. A young soldier often feels what is happening with his true instinct as a general. Dick now knew that the North would recover the field, and that the South, cut down fearfully, though having performed prodigies of valor, must fight to save herself. He felt that the resistance in front of them was no longer invincible. He saw in the flash of the firing that the Southern ranks were thin, very thin, and he knew that there was no break in their own advance. Now the sanguine Northern generals planned the entire destruction of the Southern army. There was only one road by which Beauregard could retreat to Corinth. A whole Northern division rushed in to block the way. Sherman, in his advance, came again to the ground around the little Methodist chapel of Shiloh, which he had defended so well the day before, and crowded his whole force upon the Southern line at that point. Once more the primitive church in the woods looked down upon one of the most sanguinary conflicts of the whole war. If Sherman could break through the Southern line here, Beauregard's whole army would be lost. But the Southern soldiers were capable of another and a mighty effort. Their generals saw the danger and acted with their usual promptness and decision. They gathered together their shattered brigades and hurled them like a thunderbolt upon the Union left and center. The shock was terrific. Sherman, with all his staunchness and the valor of his men, was compelled to give way. McClernand, too, reeled back. Others were driven in also. Whole brigades and regiments were cut to pieces or thrown in confusion. The Southerners cut a wide gap in the Northern army, through which they rushed in triumph, holding the Corinth road against every attack and making their rear secure. Sherman's division, after its momentary repulse, gathered itself anew, and although knowing now that the Southern army could not be entrapped, drove again with all its might upon the positions around the church. They passed over the dead of the day before, and gathered increasing vigor as they saw that the enemy was slowly drawing back.
Grant reformed his line, which had been shattered by the last fiery and successful attack of the South. Along the whole line the trumpets sang the charge, and brigades and batteries advanced. But the end of Shiloh was at hand. Despite the prodigies of valor performed by their men, the Southern generals saw that they could not longer hold the field. The junction of Grant and Buell, after all, had proved too much for them. The bugles sounded the retreat, and reluctantly they gave up the ground which they had won with so much courage and daring. They retreated rather as victors than defeated men, presenting a bristling front to the enemy until their regiments were lost in the forest, and beating off every attempt of skirmishers or cavalry to molest them. It was the middle of the afternoon when the last shot was fired, and the Southern army at its leisure resumed its march toward Corinth, protected on the flanks by its cavalry, and carrying with it the assurance that although not victorious over two armies, it had been victorious over one, and had struck the most stunning blow yet known in American history. When the last of the Southern regiments disappeared in the deep woods, Dick and many of those around him sank exhausted upon the ground. Even had they been ordered to follow, they would have been incapable of it. Complete nervous collapse followed such days and nights as those through which they had passed. Nor did Grant and Buell wish to pursue. Their armies had been too terribly shaken to make another attack. Nearly 15,000 of their men had fallen, and the dead and wounded still lay scattered widely through the woods. The South had lost almost as many. Nearly a third of her army had been killed or wounded in the battle, and yet they retired in good order, showing the desperate valor of these sons of hers. The double army which had saved itself, but which had yet been unable to destroy its enemy, slept that night in the recovered camp. The generals discussed in subdued tones their narrow escape, and the soldiers, who now understood very well what had happened, talked of it in the same way. "We knew that it was going to be a big war," said Dick, "but it's going to be far bigger than we thought." "And we won't make that easy parade down to the Gulf," said Warner. "I'm thinking that a lot of lions are in the path." "But we'll win," said Dick. "In the end we'll surely win." Then, after dreaming a little with his eyes open, he fell asleep, gathering new strength for mighty campaigns yet to come. End of chapter 16, part 2. End of The Guns of Shiloh by Joseph A. Altsheler.